We have Jennifer and Nicole. Jennifer Forman Orth is an invasive species biologist with over 20 years of experience presenting to various audiences about introduced plants, insects, and pathogens. She currently works for the Mass Department of Agricultural Resources in the Division of Crop and Pest Services on topics including invasive pest management, mosquito control, and pollinator support. Nicole leads DCR's Forest Health Program, is responsible for statewide projects investigating the impact of insects and disease on Massachusetts forests. Some of the Forest Health team's current work includes invasive insect species detection surveys, long-term monitoring plots, biocontrol species and establishment, and target treatment protection projects. Nicole has experience working with emerald ash borer, ash longhorn beetle, hemlock woolly delegate, white pine needle case disease, and beech leaf disease. Jen will be starting us off.
Should I get started? All right, I'm going to share my screen. Okay, I just want to confirm that you can see. It's well, Zoom is telling me that you can see it, so I will believe Zoom. Thanks for giving me a chance to speak to your attendees today. I'm going to jump right into things. I'm here to talk to you just about spotted lanternfly. Spotted lanternfly is a true bug in the family Fulgoridae. It's a type of plant hopper. It's the only fulgorid plant hopper in New England right now. Its scientific name is Lycorma delicatula. The reason we're concerned about it is it's an invasive sap-sucking insect. Its closest relative that you are probably familiar with would be aphids. So think about the damage that aphids can do to plants. This is a similar insect, but larger and with a less specific host range. Its hosts include tree of heaven. If it was only attacking tree of heaven, maybe we wouldn't care about it as much as we do, but unfortunately it also attacks grape, black walnut, maple, hops, and other species. I just want to show a couple of really macro shots of this insect just so that you can see the appendage that it's using to feed from the trees and other plants that it attacks. That's basically acting as a straw that it's jamming into the wood or herbaceous plant to suck out the sap. Specifically, the damage that is caused by spotted lanternfly is, again, because it's sucking out the sap of the tree or plant. When it does this, it jams that sharp mouth part right in. And I guess it's not exactly like a straw, because with a straw, you are sucking the liquid out yourself. With a phloem feeding insect like this, when they jam their mouth parts into the plant, there is a tremendous amount of pressure that ends up getting released. It's more like when you are letting the air out of the bottom of a balloon, there could be a lot of force coming through. And so it's this tremendous push of juices through the mouth parts of the insect, and then the waste product comes out the back end. And the waste product or excrement of spotted lanternfly is a lot of water, because that's going to be what's in the plant, but also a lot of sugar, because that's only part of what they're hoping to kind of filter out of the sap. And that sugary, watery substance that we call honeydew is being excreted from the insect at the same time as it's feeding. And it's dripping from the insect down onto the ground, onto the plant that it's feeding on, onto the leaves. And this honeydew is incredibly sticky and sweet, and it starts to ferment and attract fungal growth called sooty mold. In extreme situations, a heavy infestation of spotted lanternfly creates these sort of ecological dead zones where everything is covered with honeydew. The honeydew has fungal growth on it. Leaves and other green parts of plants that get covered with this honeydew can't photosynthesize as well or at all. It means that these plants are producing less nutrients for their own growth, and it has been linked to reduced cold hardiness in plants as well. And another sort of bonus aspect of this honeydew collection is that this sugary sweet substance is very attractive to a lot of insects that we consider to be pests. So wasps, hornets, bees, and ants will come to feed on the honeydew secretions and at tree wounds that are made where they're weeping sap because the lanternflies have sort of opened these little wounds on the trees. And that can be, I mean, we'll talk a little bit more about how that could be a problem, but in situations where we attract where stinging insects are attracted, it can be an issue for folks that are, for folks that have allergies and just for recreational use of properties that are experiencing infestations of this pest. So here's a photo just to show you what the sooty mold growth looks like, in this case on grape leaves. You see it's shiny, it is sticky, and you can see why they call it sooty mold, because it looks like, it basically looks like somebody burned the leaves. You get this very dark charcoaly black color on the leaves, and they're not going to be able to photosynthesize if this is completely covering the leaves. And here's just an example of some opportunistic insect feeding on the honeydew that the spotted lanternflies are creating, in this case on the bark of a tree. And that is, I think, European hornet, which is another introduced species. Generally not considered not invasive, but still can be a problem. And I just want to show you, I know this is supposed to be about conservation, but this is someone's back porch in an area that's heavily infested by spotted lanternfly. And I just think it's a good example of how an infestation of this pest can lead to sort of the interruption of the ability to just kind of, for people to be outside and enjoy the outdoors. So the bottom step is just a normal wooden step. The step above it and the one above that, you can see it looks very shiny and black. It is covered with honeydew. It is getting sooty mold all over it. This is not only unsightly and it can be really smelly, but it's very slippery too. So it's a hazard. Spotted lanternfly has a really wide host range. As I mentioned before, it attacks tree of heaven, but it also attacks over 100 other species, including everything from grapes, hops, walnut, maple, rose. So lots of different trees, shrubs, vines, and also many different types of herbaceous plants. Some of the impacts that we're concerned about here in Massachusetts would be, I would say that obviously my agency is concerned about the agricultural impacts. And because this pest attacks grape, there's a potential negative impact to vineyards. They are seeing significant losses of grape production in vineyards in Pennsylvania and other states where this pest is well established. It also can be found swarming in orchards in states where it's well established. It also attacks hops. So you've got your wine, your cider, and your beer potentially impacted, which would be something a lot of us would find to be pretty frustrating. But virtually any nursery or garden center that is growing plants that has them outside is potentially at risk from this pest damaging their stock. There are potential impacts we really don't quite understand yet to the hardwood and logging industries. We know that there's not going to be there doesn't appear to be a direct immediate impact to trees. But with, as we've seen with some other pests like winter moth, it could be that there's just long-term impacts to the ability of plants to kind of grow, thrive, and compete, especially against non-native species. And of course, we're very concerned because, the trees of the forest might not see an immediate impact from the infestation of spotted lanternfly, but we certainly have a lot of native grapes and a lot of insects that use grapes as their host plants. And we have, of course, any plant in the herbaceous understory of a forested area could also be at risk. Of course, from a recreational standpoint, people could potentially lose the ability at certain times of the year to enjoy their backyards. They might have trouble producing their own garden vegetables and fruit. And we're really concerned about the potential impact of spotted lanternfly in urban settings, especially from sort of a park use and recreational standpoint. For those of you that, work for, oversee land trusts that have urban properties where you, whether you want to or not, you have a lot of tree of heaven around, are going to be seeing potential impacts from spotted lanternfly swarming and making it just kind of unpleasant for folks to be around, and creating that sort of honeydew rain that I'm going to show you another slide or two. In Pennsylvania, they've estimated that this has already impacted them with over, $42 million of impact to the economy. So not great news for them. This is just a couple of slides showing when they are swarming that they can collect by the thousands on large established trees. They still don't quite understand what is going on here. The trees are not seeing any major impact to this, but it's startling to people, and it seems to be sort of a something they'll do for a few days and then kind of move on to another place to feed and mate. But I just wanted to show these slides to give you guys an idea of how it looks when they're congregating in large numbers. And here's just a quick video of, this is from Pennsylvania at an airport, unfortunately. Just want to show you, I mean, there's got to be 10,000 lanternflies on that one tree, and that's at an airport, so those are going to move around. And I think this is another video. So while I'm talking, just when you think you see water drops, you might think it's raining, but that's the honeydew squirting out of these spotted lanternflies as they feed. They're not feeding on the fruits, they're feeding on stems and the leaf stems and branches of the grapevines. And they've also reported finding spotted lanternfly damaging all kinds of herbaceous plants, everything from basil to cucumber and other cucurbits. And they've also been found to damage blueberries, which is another, I mean, obviously an important agricultural crop, but also an important component of the forest. Spotted lanternfly does not discriminate. If you get into a situation where there are large numbers of them and they're swarming, if you are out for a run and they're around, they're going to land on you. If you are the president of the United States, they are still going to be around and land on you. When they're out in heavy numbers, you know it, and they don't seem to care about avoiding humans. Spotted lanternfly is originally from Asia, but where it's considered native to China and Vietnam, it's actually invasive to other parts of Asia, including Korea. It's been found to spread primarily through the movement of its egg masses. In Asia, mostly it is kept in check by native predators and parasitoid wasps. We don't have that, at least right now, in the United States, where it was first found in Pennsylvania back in 2014, where it arrived via shipments of crushed stone from China. This is a map just to show you everything that Pennsylvania tried to do once lanternfly was found in terms of surveys. This is the entire state of Pennsylvania. Every place where you see a dot is where they did a survey for spotted lanternfly. This, the red is where it was actually found, and the green is where they actually checked. And if you think about how much bigger Pennsylvania is than Massachusetts, you can understand what a Herculean effort they made about trying to determine where spotted lanternfly was and possibly stop the spread. It was confined to the southeast portion of the state for the first few years, but this is a map showing you every place where we have spotted lanternfly in the United States. And this map has gotten so big that I can't even really display it well on a PowerPoint slide anymore, because we've got those little satellite finds in North Carolina and all the way up in New Hampshire and Vermont. Any place that's colored in blue on the map is where there's actual infestation found. You can see that almost half of Pennsylvania is now covered, and pretty much all of New Jersey, Maryland, Delaware. That's where the president was when that spotted lanternfly landed on him. And here's a map showing you where it is in Massachusetts. As of right now, we have documented infestations in both Shrewsbury and Fitchburg. Those are the orange colored in towns. And then the blue dots are places where we've had either, a dead lanternfly show up somewhere or possibly an egg mass on a tree that we destroyed, but no actual signs of infestation. This is just to give you idea of the pressure that we're seeing from various vectors from other states, that's going to make it really difficult to keep this pest out of Massachusetts. The first find of spotted lanternfly here in our state was in Fitchburg last summer, where somebody reported one of the sort of younger non-flying versions of spotted lanternfly. I'll talk about the life stages in a few more slides. When it was found, they couldn't find any infested trees, so they set up a bunch of traps. That's just an example of a trap. And they started checking the trap every 2 weeks to see if there were any signs of spotted lanternfly. And then in September of that year, they did find adult spotted lanternflies in the trap. Once they discovered that, they did further, more intensive investigations and found that the tree that the trap was on had some egg masses on it from previous year. They went from there to what they, wow, that is a really bad coincidence that my phone is ringing. I'm sorry. There we go. Thank you, husband, for answering that. So they did basically these grid surveys that they always do, where they, the star is where the spotted lanternflies were found in the trap. And these are 1 by 1 kilometer squares where they go in and check for mainly ailanthus trees for signs of spotted lanternfly. They expanded the survey after the preliminary survey and never found any more infested trees. So we were just like, all right, this is an isolated satellite population of spotted lanternfly in a fairly, urban area in Fitchburg. And it was just, it's actually 2 trees, I think, but it's 3 trunks. At that point, we're like, all right, we want to take these trees out. My agency doesn't have the ability to do this on their own. So luckily, and actually Nicole, who is here today to talk about other pests, was key in providing crews, equipment, and advice so that the trees could be treated. And then they were removed when the growing season was over and we knew that any lanternflies that could possibly be there were dead and the trees were tipped up. Later that December, they found a new patch of infested ailanthus, basically line of sight, a very short distance from the original infestation. And those trees were taken out as well. Actually, this past week, they were cut down and chipped up, so that we're hoping that this was it and we've got it under control. But we're going to continue to do surveys in the area just to cover. In December of last year, we got a report of a dead adult in Shrewsbury, a dead adult lanternfly in Shrewsbury that we thought was just linked to them bringing plants from a nearby big box store. But for some reason, our survey team and the folks that they were working with from USDA just decided to kind of take a look around to see if they could find anything else. And they actually found egg masses on trees in a parking lot nearby where this Shrewsbury resident lived. The survey teams are still assessing what is going on in Shrewsbury, but we're making plans to take these trees down too, because I think they've only found 5 trees so far, even though they did the same type of survey. It just seems to be limited to this parking lot, so they're hoping to take them out. So what can you do about spotted lanternfly, which is the main reason I'm here today? I want to teach you how to identify it, and I want you to understand when and where you should report it, and then talk quickly about what you can do to kind of prevent or slow the spread of this pest. So right now we're at the end of March. We are still talking to folks about looking for egg masses because that's the only stage that is alive right now. We're expecting the nymphs to start to hatch out of the eggs probably in May in Massachusetts. It will start earlier in the southern states, which means we kind of need to be keeping an eye out for hitch takers on materials that are shipped here from those states. But when the nymphs hatch, they are wingless and they are black with tiny white spots, and they don't look a lot like their adult version. But when they get close to their adult version, they go through these 4 different life stages or instars. When they get very close to being an adult, they morph into a version of themselves that is finally red with some white and black markings. But right now, we're just telling folks, keep an eye out for the egg masses. The adults are going to be active out and able to fly in the summer, probably at the end of July, but mainly active August and September until frost hits. The adults are about an inch to an inch and a half long, and they have gray spotted forewings with really vibrant red hind wings underneath. And when you see it spread out, like in this picture, you might think, well, that's going to be really obvious if I see it. But honestly, the look of this pest blends very well, especially into bark. So here's a couple of thoughts to just show you. It kind of blends in with the gray with red underneath. It somehow works and can be really difficult to detect unless you're very close to the tree that they're on. What we really want to talk to you about, for folks that are wondering, what right now, what can I do? Keep an eye out for the egg masses and keep in mind that they're only about an inch and a half long. And when the female lays them, she typically covers them with this grayish brown putty-like covering. It's not always there, but typically it's going to look like the third photo here, the covered photo. And unfortunately, they will lay these eggs on virtually any flat surface, and the eggs have no trouble overwintering here in Massachusetts and will hatch in the spring. And here's just 3 different examples to show you from far away, a very infested tree. The center is just the egg masses even more close up. And then the picture on the right is an older sort of aged egg mass, which is what we're seeing right now at some of the, at the Shrewsbury location where the putty-like covering gets all kind of cracked. But again, if you're not really close, that can blend right into the bark. In terms of hitchhiking, spotted lanternfly adults are going to come here on everything from nursery stock to vehicles that are just transporting everything from people to goods and services from other states. Once the egg masses are laid, they could be on anything from, rebar to rusted metal, camping equipment, tires, trucks, pretty much anything, which makes it even more of a challenge to control this pest. Here's some lookalikes just to kind of get the search image in your brain. Pay attention to this gray putty-like covering on the left. That's your spotted lanternfly egg mass. To the right, we have spongy moth, the new common name for Lymantria dispar. That's what you're most commonly going to see on a tree that you might mistake for an egg mass, although especially in wet years, when the fall is wet, you see a lot of fungal growth like this that people will call in a spotted lanternfly. And then you might also see praying mantis egg cases laid on trees that kind of looks like spotted lanternfly. We definitely have some folks that get confused about that. If you're not sure, you should always just report it to our website, which is massnrc.org/SLF. I will try to put that in the chat if I get a chance when Nicole is speaking. In terms of preventing or slowing the spread of spotted lanternfly, mainly if you could take the information you're getting today and go to our website and print stuff out and share it with your coworkers or land managers or anybody that you think has eyes out there on the ground and in the trees. You want them to be able to recognize spotted lanternfly on all its different life stages and to report it to us if they see it. In terms of your particular property, do you have tree of heaven? Do you have large patches of grape on your property? If you do, identify those areas and set up monthly checks for spotted lanternfly throughout the spring, summer, and fall. If you are in or near one of our known SLF infestations in Shrewsbury or Fitchburg, or you travel to some place that has spotted lanternfly, like most of Pennsylvania and most of New Jersey, you should avoid parking your vehicle under tree lines, especially if the trees are tree of heaven. And if you can't avoid that, then you need to make sure you're keeping your vehicle windows closed when you park, because these guys will sneak in through that little gap in your window. They will take a ride with you to wherever you're going and then leave and go find some place to mate and lay eggs. Also, if you would like to order free things from us, like posters and checklists like the one on the right, or ID cards, I'm going to put that link into the chat as well. That is it for me. How did I do? Not that bad. All right. I'm going to hand things over to Nicole.
All right. So can you guys see my screen? Am I sharing correctly? Good. All right. So I will be jumping around to a few different insects, but I have the chat open on my other screen. So if there's any specific questions, we're a small group, or anything you want me to dive into deeper, just pop it into the chat, and I'll try to get to that. But my name is Nicole. I am the Forest Health Director with the DCR. So I deal with statewide projects on all sorts of insects and diseases. And we use a lot of different methods of how we approach our monitoring projects, what we actually do once we identify pests and diseases, and we share a lot of information in talks like this. One of the biggest tools we use each year is our aerial survey. So I get in a tiny little Cessna plane with an iPad, and we map every inch of damage we see across the state. And it kind of gives us this really great broad picture of what's actually going on in our forests. So this is the map from 2021. It is hard to see, there's a lot going on, but luckily on our forest health story map, we have an interactive map so you can zoom into your areas and towns and kind of see what's going on. So I'm actually going to share the link in the chat, but if you forget it, if you just go to the mass.gov website and search in the search bar forest health, you can get to all of our stuff. So this always has our current year data, and it goes into more detail about a lot of our insects and diseases and the projects my team has going on. If you want some more historic data, the FEMC Regional Forest Health Atlas is a really great tool that has all of our and our neighboring states historic aerial survey information. So you can look and see like what common problems have been in your area in the last 50 years. You can search by specific pests, by specific years. So it's actually a really, really cool tool too. Because I know sharing that PDF map that I send out a lot is not super useful, and people are always zooming in and trying to figure out if it's close to them. So jumping into the insects, the first I want to talk about is the Lymantria dispar caterpillar. So this, as Jen just mentioned, it recently underwent a common name change. The Entomological Society of America is in charge of common names for insects here in the United States. So it is now known as spongy moth. So formerly gypsy moth, and now it is spongy moth from here on out. So sometimes I slip up, but I'm working on getting used to the new name. And this is new name, but it is a very old insect for us here in Massachusetts. We've had it for over 150 years in our forests. So most of the time now it's been somewhat naturalized. So it does have native insects and diseases, funguses, predators that do kind of keep the population in check. And most of the time it does function as a lot of our native forest pests do, but we do still have periods of outbreak cycles where the population will blow up and we'll see huge amounts of damage. So this is, since we really started tracking acreage and it's been statewide, and you'll see we went through cycles of outbreaks. That really low period from like the mid 50s to mid 70s, that's when we were using huge amounts of DDT. So just flying around in airplanes, spraying DDT across the landscape. I read a lot of our historic reports, and it'll be like, it was excellent at controlling it. And it was, it killed a lot of caterpillars. But it was also devastating to our ecosystems, and thankfully we stopped using it. Unfortunately, when we did stop using that, the populations did really balloon in the late 70s and early 80s. But luckily, a fungal pathogen called Entomophaga mamaega, which is very host specific to the spongy moth, became well established and kind of keeps the population in check most of the time now. But we still do have pretty big outbreaks, like 2015 to 2019. We saw quite a lot of damage across the state. So here's what we did see a big buildup in the population. And then we did see a bit of oak mortality caused by that defoliation event. So what's kind of keeping our population under? It is mostly the Entomophaga mamaega. There's also viruses, but as we've all learned in the last 2 years, in order for a virus to effectively spread, you need to be close to each other and spreading it around. So that's only really effective when the population gets very large. And the Entomophaga, it is a it rests in the soil when caterpillars are not active. And it has its own, it's a living thing. It needs its own conditions to be able to become effective. So it needs moisture, it needs the right temperatures. And with a changing climate, that those spring conditions don't always line up with what we're seeing when the spongy moth caterpillars are active. So when we saw that big buildup in the state in 2015, 2016, it was because we had pretty dry springs and we didn't have as much fungus active as we usually did. So the big blow up population in central and eastern Mass in 2015 to 2019 really seems to have ramped down, but we are seeing a bit of an uptick out in Western Mass. So in Berkshire County and Franklin County, we saw a bit of defoliation last year. That was quite noticeable, but luckily 1 year defoliation isn't too harmful to trees. Our oaks are pretty resilient and usually have enough energy stores to be able to push out new leaves mid-season and survive. It's when we get multiple years in a row where we really start to see some stress. My team goes out every winter and does egg mass surveys to kind of identify areas where we do have the potential risk for defoliation again this spring. So once again, we saw a lot of egg masses out in Berkshire and Franklin counties. It does seem to be really concentrated to areas that are high oak densities. We haven't seen it spread down into our more maple or other hardwood dominated forested areas, but areas that do have good oak components are likely at risk for defoliation once again this year. And there are also a lot of other native defoliators and other invasive defoliators that are out there in our springs and our forests too. And sometimes these can be pretty devastating. I think that anytime there's something feeding on trees, everyone's just like, oh, it's spongy moth, they're ruining my trees. But we do have things like fall cankerworm, which is a native. In the last 2 or 3 years, we've had pretty significant impact out in our coastal areas. So some pockets along Cape Cod and very significantly out on Nantucket. They've in their interior shrubby forest area, they've been seeing some pretty devastating defoliation. So it's a native insect, but it still is a pest to our forests. We've been seeing saddle prominence. There's brown-tailed moth, which we luckily haven't been seeing much of down here in Massachusetts, but our neighbors to the north in Maine have been having quite a bit of huge amounts of defoliation from it in the last few years. So with all of these defoliating insects, most of the time they don't cause too much damage. Trees, they feed generally on our hardwoods. The hardwoods are pretty resilient, so even 2 or 3 years of defoliation won't always kill a tree. When they're additionally stressed by things like drought or other pests and diseases, then we do see mortality a little bit more. So most of the time we can just wait it out with things like spongy moth. If you do have some trees you want to treat and protect or that are providing an aesthetic value where you don't want to see it all bare and naked in the middle of the summer, there are some treatment options. Most of it is Bacillus thuringiensis, so BTK is most of the products, and there's a few different name brand products, but that's the main active ingredient is BT, and it is a biological base, and it is very active against caterpillars. It's just important to time it correctly. And BT can be used on most of these Lepidoptera caterpillar feeding. It's pretty active against them, but it's when you want to time it correctly so that it is out on your foliage when they are actively feeding and still young. So with spongy moth, you want to make sure your treatments are out and on by early May, so you catch them right after they hatch out in that late April, early to May time. Brown-tail moth is a little bit more challenging because it has a split life cycle where it overwinters as a caterpillar larvae, and then it becomes active again in the spring, and in the middle of the summer is when they pupate, become adults, and lay eggs. So you want to catch it early in the spring when they first start to come back out of their webs. Fall cankerworm and winter moth are both really early season, so they are out as soon as bud breaks. So you want to know kind of before going in the season if you're at risk. And a lot of the applications are challenging to do yourself, so it is beneficial to hire arborists that have the right equipment to get up into a canopy. If you have things like small apple trees and things like that, you can purchase it at like local Home Depot stores like that. But you have to be able to reach all of the foliage to get a good application, which is sometimes a little bit harder to do on your own. I'm going to talk a little bit about the hemlock woolly adelgid now. So we've been seeing it all over the state. We've had a huge population increase in the last 2 years. So if you flip your hemlock needles over, you'll see those nice fuzzy white balls underneath, and then hidden under that wool are these little adelgids. So much like the spotted lanternfly, they're piercing and sucking to feed right at the base of the needles on those trees. And it's actually only in the adult phase that they make that nice wool. A lot of the time they're very small. If you can see them with the naked eye, it looks like a flake of pepper is like hanging out right at the base of the needles. But as they mature, they get nice and juicy and then start putting a wool on before they start producing eggs. And they don't kill a tree right away, but that feeding and reducing the vigor of trees over time can lead to tree decline and mortality. And we have seen areas where we've lost quite a significant portion of our hemlock forest from hemlock woolly adelgid. It's been here since the late 80s, and we do still have plenty of hemlocks on the landscape, but most of our areas are impacted by HWA. But luckily for us here in the Northeast, our winter temperatures can really knock the population back down. So they do a lot of their feeding and actually the colder temperatures. So like a 40-degree time of year. So nice from like September to early December. And then again from like early March to May is when they get like a lot of their feeding done. They're very active in that cool season, 40-degree days. And they don't actually like it when it's really warm. They actually are kind of in like a resting mode in the summer where they aren't doing too much feeding. They're just kind of waiting it out through those really warm temperatures. So they like that cool season, but they don't like when it gets really cold. So they don't like those temperatures below zero. They don't like sudden changes, which is what gets them a lot here in Massachusetts, where we have like 40-degree days and then a 5-degree day, and then back up to 30, and then all of a sudden below zero. It's a bit shocking to them, which it's not as stressful as if it was just 40 and then it became 30 and then it became 20 and then it was 10. They can harden off to those temperatures a little bit better, but when we have those sudden changes is when we do see a bit of mortality here. But we had pretty mild winters in 2020 and 2021, which allowed the adelgid populations to really increase. So there's actually 2 generations per year. They're called a cistin and a progredion generation. And it's an all-female population. So even if 99% of them die in the winter from cold temperatures, and you have one single female there, she's able to produce like 100 eggs, and it can readily get reinfested again. So we go through these cycles where they get knocked back by winter, then all of a sudden they'll build back up again really rapidly in years where we have mild winters, and then they'll get knocked back down. But they're very resilient. They are very small and travel, get hitchhiked around on birds a lot. So even if an area lost all of their adelgid population, it could readily get reinfected again. And we have some things we're doing to control it. We are attempting to establish biocontrol beetles. So these are actually predatory beetles that eat the adelgid. We have released 2 species in the past, but the ones we're trying to get established now are called Laricobius nigrinus. So there's these little black beetles. And we haven't had the best success here in Massachusetts. And part of it is because we have those winters that knock back the adelgid. It also knocks back the beetle, and it knocks back the beetle's food source. So sometimes we do have this beetle starting to establish, they're building up, and then they suddenly have nothing to eat. So their population dies back. We do go out and look. We've released at numerous sites across the state in the last 25 years. But we really haven't had the best of luck. So we're still working on it. And there's a new species, it's called the silverfly, that researchers from UMass and Cornell are going to attempt to establish here in Massachusetts this year. And that actually works on the summer generation. So it will hopefully be able to survive our winters a little bit better and be more impactful. We do also have elongate hemlock scale on our hemlocks. So this is an armored scale. If you flip over your foliage and look undersides of the needles, they're flat, they're oval, they're brownish usually. And these don't get hit back as hard by winter temperatures. They're a little bit hardier in that sense. So We do see this widespread throughout the state. On its own, elongate hemlock scale is a little less devastating than just adelgid on their own, but the sites where we have both of them, it's really stressful to our trees, and those are the sites we're seeing the biggest declines. We do treat hemlocks on some of our state forests, so areas that are ecologically significant or just very historically important. And we do dinotephron-based products, which attack both the adelgid and the scale. You can do imidacloprid for adelgid, but it's not quite as effective against the scale. So we choose to use the dinotephron-based products. And giving a little bit of update about the emerald ash borer. This is no new news here in Massachusetts. We've had it here since 2012, and it's become pretty widespread and established throughout most of the state. The areas in the southeast where we haven't detected it, most of those areas just don't have a lot of ash, not that it's not there. It's likely in almost all of our communities at this point. And we're starting to see a lot of tree decline and mortality. So when it gets into a site, you'll start to see decline after maybe 2 to 3 years of an infestation, but by 5 to 6, you're seeing that high level of mortality. So most of our areas, we are reaching that point. And it becomes challenging for communities, for homeowners, landowners, interest groups like land trusts to deal with these hazardous trees on the landscape. And ash become really brittle really quickly. So once you kind of seeing your canopy die back, it is really time to think about safely removing trees that are in high-risk corridors, so like parking lots, buildings, high-use trails, picnic and camp areas. There are pesticide treatment options. So the picture there is of a great resource. It's insecticide options for protecting ash trees, and it was worked on out in the Midwest, where EAB first came into the United States, and was done cooperatively with states and a bunch of researchers to go through the different options and timing for them and effectiveness. We utilize emamectin benzoate when we treat our ash, but we do really limited ash treatments. It is rather expensive and costly, and you do need to treat before you have a really high level infestation. So you can treat when you have some EAB in your tree already, but it is most effective if you kind of get the chemicals into the trees before EAB really starts attacking that tree to be the most successful at protecting it. We do release biocontrols. We've released 3 parasitic wasp species. And though it looks like they have stingers, it's actually ovipositors. So they're using those to get their eggs into the EAB. We've released at, I believe, 26 sites already in Massachusetts, and we're releasing again at 5 sites this year. So we're getting them well distributed in all counties where we have EAB. And the goal of this is they won't protect the trees that are there now, but as we kind of get into this next regrowth of ash that come up after this initial wave of EAB, we'll have a tool on the landscape to kind of help naturalize the EAB, reduce its impact, and help protect some of our future ash trees. And I want to talk a little bit about southern pine beetles. So this is an insect that's native to the southern United States, and it is a tiny little bark beetle. So it's smaller than a grain of rice. It's more like the size of a quinoa. They're very tiny, but they can really be devastating because they aggregate in huge densities. So they release pheromones. They're also really attracted to plant volatiles, and they will come in tens of thousands of them attacking trees. They also have multiple generations per year, so they can keep like infecting that tree until it's dead. It, as the name implies, it is a pine beetle, so they love a wide variety of pine trees. Here in Massachusetts, the preferred hosts are pitch pine. And when they get into stands, they can cause really rapid decline in mortality. So within a single growing season, you can see it spread throughout a stand of trees and kill tens to hundreds of trees within one single growing season. And in the South, it's very devastating because it stays warm. They have a much longer growing season, and it can have up to 8 generations per year. Here in Massachusetts, we're about 2 generations per year. Areas that are a little bit south of us, like New York and New Jersey, that have had some outbreaks, they get up to about 4 generations per year. But if we have a mild fall where they're able to push a little bit more, and then an early spring and nice long growing season, we do have the potential here to have an outbreak and see some tree mortality. So we do trap for it. We have identified it in multiple locations throughout the state, but when I catch it in a trap, I find like 2 beetles. Compared to New York, when they trap, they'll catch like 1,000. So it is present here. It's very low numbers. We haven't found it in trees yet, but we are out there looking for it so we can be proactive if we do have an outbreak event and kind of reduce the spread and mortality event from it. In New York this year, they found it at the northernmost point they have. So up in the Catskills in Copac, and the tree was about 800 feet from our border. But the only pitch pine we have in that area are mountaintop, very small shrubby pitch pine. And we've gone through and haven't noticed any impact or any signs in our trees, but we will be trapping out in that area down in Mount Washington this year. But as the climate changes, warmer temperatures, longer growing seasons, we will likely see more and more of southern pine beetle here in Massachusetts, and it will probably become a bigger pest for us. And finally, I want to talk about beech leaf disease. So not technically an insect, it is actually caused by a foliar nematode. And it's very new. It was first identified in 2012 out in Ohio. And for the first 5 years, no one knew what was causing it. Like someone out in their Metro Parks area was like, something weird is happening to these beech, saw it getting worse, saw it spreading. Researchers from out in Ohio State with the Forest Service put in a lot of work and effort, and it took them about 5 years to really confirm that this is being caused by a nematode. And we still don't know a lot of answers. We don't know exactly how it's infecting trees, how it's spreading, how it's getting to new areas. There are no currently approved control methods. So it is very new. It is something we are kind of concerned about here in Massachusetts because we first identified it down in Plymouth in 2020. And since that time, we've actually found it in 6 of our counties. So it is here. Some of these are areas where we have long-term monitoring plots we were putting in. So sites I thought were uninfected, went in to do these health metrics. And when we really start scrutinizing a tree and its foliage, we found 2, 3, 4 leaves that had very mild symptoms. So it is likely in more areas than is in this map, but it is something that is so new. We are still just working on figuring out where it is in our state. So I welcome any reports of it, and my team are out there. As soon as the leaves will be on, they'll be out there looking for symptoms. So this is the nematode, and foliar nematodes foliar nematodes that are pathogenic to trees are really rare. It's not like beetles, boring beetles, caterpillars, those are all really common things. There's a lot of different species causing that kind of damage. But a foliar nematode is very weird. It is something new. So we don't really have a lot of that background knowledge to build on for a new threat like beech leaf disease. But it causes this dark, really obvious symptoms are dark bands on the leaves. So if you go out anytime after leaves come out, the symptoms are there as soon as the leaves start emerging. So get out there, you look up against the sunlight, and you can see these dark interveinal bands. When the disease is new, you'll maybe see like 2 or 3 on a leaf. And as they progress, most of the leaf will be covered by that. And when it's really advanced, the leaves will just come out really withered and curled. And they actually aren't brittle. They almost feel like thick and leathery, but they are not useful for a tree to photosynthesize. And when you have really symptomatic leaves, they do drop off early. Usually by July, a tree will drop really symptomatic leaves because it's not worth the energy that they're expending holding on to it. But the leaves that are mildly symptomatic will be held on through the fall. So as you see color change start happening, you can still find the symptomatic leaves. And we've been trying to see if you can do winter surveys. Beech like to hold on to their leaves into the winter. So we were trying to see, you can kind of see the symptoms a little bit, even on those like fully browned up leaves in the winter time, but it is a little more challenging. And it does seem like it kills trees. So it has been shown out in the Ohio and New York to kill trees, saplings in as little as like 6 or 7 years. But it can also kill mature trees. We just don't really know how it progresses, how long it's been in some of these sites. So it is challenging for us to identify where we think this disease will happen in Massachusetts and what we expect. But we are doing long-term monitoring plots. We are identifying new areas. We are mapping the spread and trying to figure out what we can do at this point here. So what does the future hold for invasive insects? There's always a risk for new invaders. As our climates change and our conditions change, we will probably see new invasives that couldn't be supported here before. We may also see altered impacts of our established invasive species. So in addition to warmer temperatures, we're going to be getting changes in our precipitation and how we receive that. So it can alter some of our native pest species. And going through periods of drought or periods of like extreme rain can be additional stresses to trees, as well as like big wind and storm events that can break and cause other mechanical damage. So we're always looking for the next thing. So if you see something weird going on in your trees or have questions or concerns, like always feel free to give me a call. That is my cell phone number. That's my email. And my team are always excited to answer questions. I do suggest if you see something weird, take a picture. Take a picture of it because that's the easiest way to explain it. And we do come out and do site visits. So if you know, depending on the time of year, sometimes we're really busy, but if you do have big concerns on like one of your big properties or areas, or you're just not really sure what's going on, we do try to get out and help people and give guidance. So always feel free to reach out. And if you do see beech leaf disease, please report it to me because we're trying to map that as well as we can. I saw one question pop up, but it was kind of too long for me to read while talking. So is it okay if I jump in and answer that one?
Yeah, so we can transition into the question and answer. Thank you very much, both Nicole and Jen, for all that really useful information that I, as a stewardship manager, will definitely be implementing. I'm just gonna drop the survey for the conference in the chat. Please take the time to fill it out, as that feedback is really helpful, and definitely let's answer Freddie's question.
Okay, so the question was, can you discuss the impact of treating ash with chemicals on pollinators? So there is always a risk when you're using any pesticide that it will impact other species. The treatment when I treat ash, we use emamectin benzoate and we do direct stem injections. So it does it minimizes that risk because the chemical is only going into ash, and ash are not usually used too much by pollinators, so it does decrease that risk, but there is always some impact. And there are, as stated, like there are other caterpillars and species that do utilize ash that can, so it's a systemic, so it goes fully throughout the tree. So when other insects feed on it, they can be impacted by that as well. Part of it is kind of a risk versus result. So if there are caterpillars and other things that do depend on ash, but if we don't have any ash remaining, so I don't do very much. I don't really do much treatments with it. We only do a handful of trees that are really very significant, like less than 20 a year on state properties. But I know a lot of towns and communities do try to do a lot of ash treatments. But I see Freddie's hand up, so is it okay if we just call on people? Or yeah, if you want to.
Yeah, hi. So I'm Freddie Gillespie. I'm on the chair of the Open Space Preservation Commission in Southborough. And there was a recent finding of the emerald ash borer documented. We were white on the map until this year of towns that were infested or had documentation. And the concern is that people just immediately want to go out and treat. And I did have a conversation with someone, I think in your a tree expert department of the state, and it just made me more concerned than ever that people are just going to rush out and try to treat these trees, because one of the comments was, if it worked, they wouldn't have spread. For how many years have they been? Didn't they start out in like Central or Midwest? So it just seems spending a lot of money, it's not going to work, and it will damage. You know, I put up the documentation in the chat from the National Wildlife. 139 species use ash in my zip code as a host plant. That doesn't seem insignificant to being exposed to neonicotinoids that we're pretty sure the reason they say you only need to treat it every like 5 years for results is that the chemical stays active during that time. So it's staying active to harm the usage as a host plant as well, isn't it?
Yeah, well, so typically with ash, we see a lot of the products for like 2 to 3 years being really active. And ash are like, they're also like, they're not very long lived. They're very sensitive. So I don't see it as being like, I don't see a huge amount of people running out to treat it. I think the bigger concern are some of these predatory companies that come out and they use chemicals that aren't quite as effective against emerald ash borer, but can be more impactful to pollinators. So it's the biggest thing is trying to like share resources and information with homeowners and other individuals interested in treating so that they are making thoughtful decisions. Because I mean, in the end, these are pesticides that are legal in our state and are labeled for use for this. So it is, people have that ability, but making people informed of what that involves it can be challenging at times.
And we do have another question in the chat from Ken.
So Ken asks, what is the most impactful infestation in the area around Newton? So, I mean, I will say that insects, there's like these very complicated webs of what controls them. So some years it can be things like out in Newton, spongy moth for 5 years ago was a really big problem, but right now with the hemlock woolly adelgid building up, I would say the hemlocks at some of our sites we treat out in Newton are they're struggling. We assess trees out in Hemlock Gorge, and I know that they're really having a hard time right now. But in the area, there's also emerald ash borer, and we have had winter moth in that area in the past too. So it depends from year to year, kind of what the most impactful is. But the Forest Health Atlas that I shared is a really great tool because it kind of shows you can look over the last 10 years and kind of see what was in your area and what some of the big outbreaks and pests have been.
I have a question, but I can hold it unless if there's more questions from other audience members.
So I was going to send one in the chat, but I'll just read it out loud. So are the data pictured like presence points and affected towns available for download online? And do you guys do any like predictive modeling with these to like make your search easier? Like I'm imagining you in this plane, like looking at forest health, but have you used any like remotely sensed things or?
So first, if you go to mass.gov and you type like any of the pests of concern's name in, like to the little search, we try to keep our maps updated on there. In our story map, if you click through each pest, sometimes if we have information, we will put our maps in there and try to keep those up to date too. And there are some predictive modeling tools, but they end up being like pretty coarse. Like the Forest Service has like a risk map, but it ends up just being like broad forest things. And since we're such a small state, it's not always quite as useful. So for my team, it's like learning like corridors where ash are more common, and then kind of following those higher risk sites based on, and we'll do like buffer mapping out into our higher risk areas. But we did try, so we weren't able to fly in 2020, and we tried to use remote sensing data. So it's satellite imagery, and they check disturbance based on like our usual green coverage, looking at changes in signature at like specific time periods. And it did not work really well for us because we have so much human interface here in Massachusetts. Like we're pretty dense, we're really developed. There's like roads and little houses all intermixed in our trees, which kind of threw off the signature. It's useful out in like Colorado when they have like mountain pine beetle outbreaks. But I didn't find it as fine-tuned for us here yet. So they're working on machine learning things where they can, like we can pull data out a little bit better from some of these satellite imagery, but it's not quite there yet. So it's not useful for me as a manager at this point. Using my own eyes is a little bit more valuable still.
So my question can be directed at either of you. What are some things that an everyday landowner can do to kind of help protect their land and protect the world by not spreading this? Like, what is active things they can do to keep from spreading invasives?
Most of the time it's not moving wood is really like the number one thing, and trying to, that doesn't mean you can't use trees or you can't cut trees, but trying to find local resources. Like a lot of communities now are building up like local wood banks. So being part of a program like that where they're staying close in your community, if you do have a tree that you know has like something going on, like emerald ash borer, if you can't like use it right on that area, chipping is always a really great resource. So for our Asian longhorn beetle quarantine in Worcester, we do grind and chip all of the host trees so that they are no longer suitable for the larvae to survive. So I'm really just like being thoughtful about where trees are going and what you're doing with it. And even you don't have to be an expert on like all these insects or diseases or identifying it. But if you know your property and like take time to like walk and notice things and be like, oh, this tree usually looks like that. Or so you can pick up on, I get a lot of homeowners that are just like, oh, it died overnight, but it didn't. It took 2 or 3 years to get to that point. And like getting to know your trees can help identify when something's a little bit wrong. So you can, I don't know, call someone like me or Jen and be like, hey, I think something funky's going on out here. Or you can notice like some damage signs a little bit more readily, because you notice that it's not usual.
I think the one thing I would add or expand on that, what Nicole was saying, is that if you haven't already, try to put more resources into completing inventories of what plants you have on your properties, since we're here at a land trust meeting. That, that was one of the things that I remember was a challenge for folks with emerald ash borer, was just knowing whether they had ash on their properties and where and how much. And when you have something like emerald ash borer that can come through and kill a tree in just a few years, then it becomes important because you need to assess whether there's things like, whether there's like hazards, like whether you need to do tree removals and things like that. So I know there's sometimes funding resources available, at least for tree inventories, but it just makes sense to kind of know where things are and to have a record of it so that it's not just contained in one person's brain that's the land manager.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you. So we're at time. It's past 11:30. I don't know if there's any pressing questions or last comments that either of the speakers want to give.
Nope, just, I mean, Jen and I, we have small teams, so we have limited eyes out there. So keep your eyes open and always feel free to contact us if you have questions or concerns.